I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail, is New Zealand's love affair with property finally fading?
For the first time in years, property is no longer being seen as providing the best returns. Instead, KiwiSaver and managed funds have emerged as top performers for investors.
I think what we're seeing across the board with shares and with KiwiSaver and managed funds is that they're allowing people to take on investments in manageable chunks. And platforms have definitely made it easier to do that.
I think we are on a bit of a cusp of a change, and unless you're sort of closely following the property market, you possibly haven't picked up on this. But yes, the tide is turning.
It's been a national obsession for decades, wealth through property. We've seen huge untaxed gains on such investments, with values soaring and first home buyers priced out of the market. In the 2000s, the phrase housing crisis entered the lexicon. Politicians of all stripes have pulled levers to try and take the heat out of the situation. And now?
Investors seem to be wary, I would say, and there's a range of reasons for that.
At the moment, townhouses are taking on average about 18% longer to sell here in Auckland. In Christchurch, it's even worse because Christchurch is like the townhouse capital of the country now.
Rents are pretty weak at the moment, so things are tilted in favour of tenants.
Getting a handle on what's going on can be slippery and conflicting. The townhouse market is stagnant, but new data from Infometrics shows consents for them grew by 14% in the year to January. ASB's latest investor confidence survey indicates investors are preferring to put their money in KiwiSaver and managed funds rather than property. There are enough houses for people to live in, but are they getting more affordable? Today, I'm talking to a property editor in Auckland, a property economist based in the South Island, and the ANZ's chief economist, Sharon Zollner. Sharon first for an overview of where the property sector is heading.
Well, certainly there's just the usual cycle going on, although that said, it hasn't been quite the usual cycle, has it, when house prices go up 50% in 2 years from levels that are already considered unaffordable. You know there's going to be something ugly on the other side. So, it has been a pretty brutal cycle, but it has been orderly. So, to start with the good news first, it has actually been remarkably orderly given the scale of the bubble that preceded it. Some of that is more good luck than good management insofar as inflation actually really helped. We had wage growth of almost 10% a year, and most of it wasn't real in terms of an increase in the purchasing power. It was just compensation for inflation. But it all meant that house price to income ratio, which is one of the key measures we think about when we're thinking about housing affordability, it meant that nominal wage growth did a lot of the work. So basically, to get house prices all the way back down to where they were before the bubble, they actually only had to give up half of their gain. So that's still a big, big fall. But if the house prices had had to do more of the adjustment, we would have had a lot more people sitting in negative equity. For example, there are still some, those you bought in late 2021 towards the end of the bubble, for example, with high debt loadings, but it could have been more. So that's the good news, but it has nonetheless been a pretty tough cycle. However, real house prices relative to incomes are actually a little bit lower now than they were before that bubble. So that's not the reason why house prices are kind of flat at the moment. We've kind of finished with that adjustment and we're on to the next cycle, as it were. The Reserve Bank obviously cut interest rates a lot, having raised them a lot, and we are seeing some response, certainly. Our sales have lifted. We're seeing more demand for high loan-to-value ratio lending. The first home buyers have kind of got the field to themselves, and some of them are taking advantage of it. But then the immediate question is, why have they got the field to themselves? Where are the investors? And I think that's where it gets interesting.
All right, let's talk about that. And so just one clarification. When you say it's been orderly, do you mean there hasn't been any great rupture in mortgagee sales and, doom and disaster? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. No, if you had the biggest housing bubble in the world and you had no financial stability concerns coming out the other side, then you have to kind of wipe your forehead and be grateful for that, at least. Cold comfort as that would be to the people who have lost money, as always have.
Okay, what are we seeing with investors?
So investors seem to be wary, I would say, and there's a range of reasons for that. If you're thinking of renting out a house, and the fact that new rents are falling is a problem right off the bat. New rents were down about 3% nationally. They were down pretty much double digit in Wellington at one point. So it's not just a question of how much rent you actually get, but of course also your choice of tenant would also be more limited in that scenario. That likely related to the very strong outflows of Kiwi citizens that we've seen moving to Australia in this cycle, which has just been, it's been very large, but you can explain it perfectly with the relative unemployment rates in the two countries. That their economy's been stronger than ours, and so people have responded accordingly. And on our forecast, it should get less from here, but not turn positive, still remain negative. So that's a dampener for those who are considering renting out a house. Also, while interest rates have come down a long way, they're nowhere near the lows that they saw in the previous boom, and indeed they're higher than they were because as the economy has recovered, the market has, of course, moved to recognise that more OCR cuts are unlikely, and now it's a question of when the Reserve Bank will be hiking. So the Reserve Bank chose to sound very reassuring last month. It sounded very confident that inflation would fall back to target later this year, and so we did see a bit of pressure come out of rates. But nonetheless, the point remains we're past the turn. But also I think there's just a bigger structural issues. I mean, what I've talked about there is cyclical stuff. But I think what your question really gets to is the longer term structural stuff can we expect similar returns from the next 10 years, say, in the housing market that we've seen over the last decades? And there I think more people are realising the answer is probably not.
Yeah, that's really interesting because there's been a lot of criticism over those decades that New Zealand hangs its GDP on house flipping, basically, house investment, and that's not real wealth. Are we seeing a change in mentality with the Sharesies generation coming up?
I think that's possibly part of it. It's an awful lot easier to get on the Sharesies ladder or the share market ladder generally than it is to get on the housing ladder. So that probably is one factor for a lot of young people. Just getting into the housing market isn't actually a realistic form of first saving. But also I think, the housing has had large tax advantages in New Zealand for a long time, and those persist. However, I do wonder if there might be an increasing recognition amongst housing investors that, okay, we might not get a capital gains tax this year and maybe not next cycle, maybe not the next one after that, but how long can New Zealand really remain such an outlier internationally and refuse to have that conversation? So I think perhaps there might be a recognition that the tax advantages of housing could erode over time, but that's really speculative, of course. Another issue is that essentially we've had a very strong upward trend in the ratio of house prices to income. Not so much in recent years, but certainly over the decades from the 1990s onwards. That was enabled by a downward trend in interest rates as inflation was brought under control, and there was a trend decline in probably neutral interest rates as well. One bit of the reason, basically, there was a very strong downward trend in rates, which meant there was a very strong upward trend in the amount of debt that people can service, and that enabled a long-term upward trend in house prices relative to income. Now, interest rates literally hit zeros during COVID, so in a lot of countries, they went negatives in some places. So that trend definitively ended. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that rates are going to trend higher from here, but the house prices to incomes, even if rates just sort of cycle flat from here, then you won't have that upward trend in how much debt people can handle. And therefore you cannot maintain an upward trend in house prices relative to incomes over the long term.
Last month, the Reserve Bank fronted up to Parliament's Finance and Expenditure Committee. Chief Economist Paul Conway suggested that thanks to factors including intensification, we may be seeing a structural change in the housing market, a move away from a situation where the country's economic growth was tied up with ever-rising house prices. Sharon's sceptical about that, but says the signs are encouraging. But Business Desk property editor Maria Slade believes we are on the cusp of a change.
People feel really wealthy when they see their house price increasing 10, 20, 30%, whatever it was. And we're not going to see that again. And so perhaps people are starting to see houses a bit more as something you live in and not necessarily an investment. And also, successive governments have tightened the rules around property investment. It's not quite as attractive as it used to be. And also it's just the costs have made it also less attractive. Insurance has gone up, rates have gone up, You've got to be getting pretty good rents to get a good yield out of an investment property now. So that's also, I think, changed the mindset a wee bit. And yeah, I think that the tide has turned in terms of how New Zealanders are looking at property.
Good thing?
Yes, I think it is a good thing. I think we have way too much wealth tied up in property in this country. It's unproductive wealth. It just sits there on a 700-metre section. It's not doing anything for the country. So yes, we definitely need to get over that one if the country's going to become more prosperous going forward.
Kelvin Davidson is the chief property economist at Cotality. I asked him if things are changing enough to declare the housing crisis over.
It depends on what you mean by housing crisis. I suppose what people think about when they think about that over the past 20 or 30 years is as an affordability crisis. House prices have been too high in relation to incomes. It's been a stretch for people to get on the housing ladder. I mean, I don't think it's ever been easy to buy your first house. There's been different challenges through time, but certainly in the last 20 or 30 years, one of those big challenges has been housing affordability, and that's what people have been thinking of when they say crisis, undersupplied dwellings, and rising house prices. So is that crisis over, if that's what you mean by crisis? Maybe. I think we may be reaching a turning point in the market now where I guess the mindset is shifting and people are starting to realise that actually ever rising house prices isn't necessarily the best thing for our country. We don't get richer as a country by buying and selling each other's houses. So I just wonder if that mindset is changing a little bit now, and we're potentially going to see less house price growth in future. I think we'll still see house prices go up to some extent, but maybe that growth will be less than what it's been in the past. So, is it over? I mean, maybe not, but is there reason to be optimistic that we'll see better housing affordability in future? I'd say yes. So slightly nuanced view there perhaps, but I think I'm just detecting a bit of a mindset change, and that the chances of mass undersupply of housing re-emerging at certain points in future are probably lower than what we've seen in the past, and so I think it'll be a fairer market for everyone.
One of the big developments changing the property scene is intensification in the major cities. Apartment blocks and townhouses squashed onto sections where once perhaps stood a single home. Property commentators say too many of them, it seems.
There's no doubt that the developments where you've got maybe 6, 8 terraced houses, 3-bedroom terrace houses all in a row on a section, or on what was a 1,000 square metre section, it's not that they're struggling to sell, but there are so many of them that there's just not enough demand to meet that supply. I mean, they don't sell easily, but it's not that they're unsellable. There's just too many of them.
No doubt there has been a big growth in that stock of townhouses in Auckland, in Christchurch, other parts of the country as well. And you read a lot about how some developers are they'd like to sell them, but it's taking longer. Might have to put it into the rental sector instead, put it into short-term holiday Airbnb, that sort of thing. And so that does hint that perhaps supply is outstripping demand a little bit. But at the same time, we're not seeing townhouse values collapse either. So in terms of the prices for these things, they are maybe sort of drifting sideways, but so are lots of other property types too. So it's not as if townhouses are dramatically underperforming, which sort of hints that there's some construction going on, but there's demand there for them too. So it's there's lots of different moving parts, I guess.
Have we potentially reached the limit on how many people are happy to exist in a townhouse?
Yeah, well, hard question to answer. I mean, certainly, if you look back 20 or 30 years, people might have gone, no way I'd ever live in a townhouse, and then tastes change and affordability pressures change, and I guess what we're seeing now is actually there's decent demand to live in this type of property. I mean, have we reached a limit? Yeah, not sure. I mean, if you look at other countries, a much higher proportion of the population lives in more intensified dwelling style. Now, I don't think we'd ever get to the sort of full-on apartment living that you might see in some larger cities around Asia, for example. But sort of apartment living, townhouse living is probably still quite a bit lower, even compared to somewhere like Australia. So, yeah, I think there's more scope for growth there. It's probably going to be a bit of a slow burner. It'll take some time, but certainly I detect that the tastes are changing, and people are very happy to have a bit less land and have a bit more time to do other things rather than mowing lawns and pruning hedges and things. So it's been a trend that's been underway for a while. Have we reached the limit? Yeah, I'm not so sure. I think there's probably more scope for growth there, which developers will be pleased to hear, no doubt.
It's interesting. Definitely townhouses are not selling very well at the moment. But OPES did a bit of number crunching for me, and they reckoned that at the moment townhouses are taking on average about 18% longer to sell here in Auckland. In Christchurch it's even worse, because Christchurch is like the townhouse capital of the country now, where something like 25% of houses are townhouses now. And it's about 29% down there, OPES believes. So when you average it out, it doesn't sound so bad. But if you look at it on the ground, the problem is that a lot of these townhouses are sitting on the market so long that they no longer qualify as new builds, which was an interesting kind of twist on the story that we hadn't thought of. And then we started looking into it. And sure enough, if a property sits on the market longer than 6 months, is generally the cut-off, it's not considered a new build anymore. And so therefore, a first home buyer that's wanting to access low deposit lending, either from the bank or through the government first home scheme, they can't, because they're not buying a new build. And particularly also if the property's been rented out, which is what a lot of developers are doing with stock that they can't sell. Stands to reason. Why would they not get some income off it? So they do want to sell it, but they can't. So they rent it out. So therefore it's not a new build anymore either. So yes, this is another sort of fat twist in the whole story of the fact that basically we've overbuilt on townhouses at the moment. We'd had incredibly low interest rates, we'd had a housing boom, we'd had more permissive planning conditions, and these things just sprung up everywhere. And there was no constraints on whether they were 9 townhouses in Henderson or in Sandringham or somewhere much more central. And then, of course, the other thing was they removed the minimum parking requirements, and this again was a central government edict, and that happened across the country, it wasn't just Auckland. But it allowed developers to squeeze as many townhouses as they could onto a site and not necessarily provide parking. And so that's created a whole nother set of issues. And so you have these really quite small townhouses kind of crammed in because developers want to obviously maximise the profit they can off a site. And so that's led to some not entirely great outcomes in design. Some townhouses are perfectly fine, and there are people who think, well, I don't need a full house, it's cheaper to get into a townhouse, I might get one more central to the city. Yeah, it's a perfectly acceptable way of living, especially in a city the size of Auckland. But I think one of the points is that, as I say, it has led to some pretty, subpar kind of outcomes. And now that there's a massive choice, a big glut of property on the market following the downturn, buyers can afford to be picky. And even some of these cheap ones are sort of 600,000. So why would a first home buyer want to invest that kind of money on a townhouse in Henderson with no car park when they could perhaps pay just a bit more and get something far more optimal?
Interestingly, this week, Infometrics, just a couple of minutes before our interview started, put out its dwelling consents figures. And it says townhouses were the clear leader in a growing number of dwelling consents, growing 14% and adding nearly 2,000 consents from last year. How does that marry with what we're seeing with our eyes, the for sale signs everywhere? What really is happening?
Well, I would say there are townhouses and then there are townhouses. What those figures don't break out is whether, for example, you might be talking about freestanding townhouses. And the real estate agents are telling us that that's what developers, in a lot of instances, particularly in the more well-heeled suburbs, shall we say, are moving towards, because they can see that people want that product. They don't want 7 townhouses squeezed in without a turning circle to get out of their garages. They might look at a development of 4 freestanding townhouses and they might be prepared to pay more for that. So I think maybe the development styles are changing. That doesn't really break that down. The other point is, of course, consents doesn't equal buildings. So
Yes.
maybe
So they're planning ahead a bit,
Yes.
perhaps getting them themselves out of the ditch that's been dug for them.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So, I think a consent lasts for 2 years or something. So, they might be planning ahead there, and it doesn't necessarily mean that those houses will get built. It also doesn't break it down as to where some of those developments are happening. Are they in the far-flung suburbs, or are the developers starting to see that, they really need to provide a bit more of a urban-friendly kind of product for people? So it doesn't quite tell the whole story. And, there's always going to be more intensified living in a city like Auckland. That's definitely the way we're heading. I just think, there's been so many problems with some of these townhouse developments. FENZ, Fire and Emergency, had a big problem because they couldn't get their fire engines down some of these driveways. And the thing is there, it's not always a matter of fire. FENZ are quite often the first responders. So if someone has a heart attack or something like that, there are issues with children playing in driveways. So, the council had to bring in rules around fencing off the driveways. So there's just been so many problems with this kind of unfettered development of townhouses around Auckland. And I think there's been a bit of a backlash basically against that.
So is New Zealand still locked into its love affair with houses?
All the property commentators pretty much will tell you, like I've spoken to Sharon Zollner at ANZ about this, they will say that the property market in the next 30 years is not going to look remotely like the property market we've had in the last 30 years. Prices are not going to boom the way they have, certainly not the way they did during COVID. And one of the main reasons for that is interest rates went as low as they could possibly go. They couldn't go any lower. In fact, in some countries they went negative. We're not going to see that again. And that's what drove the huge housing booms that we saw. So housing prices will continue to go up probably, but not in the increments that we've seen. They used to pretty much double every 10 years. That's possibly not going to happen going forward. The latest ASB Investor Confidence Survey shows that pretty much for the first time, or certainly in recent times, Kiwis are viewing investments like shares and KiwiSaver more favourably than houses. And the newer generation coming through, I think, have a better idea about this. They're the Sharesies generation. They do have a better concept that there's other places to put your money. So maybe
That's good though, isn't it?
It is. It is good because there's so much of our wealth that goes into this very unproductive asset, which is a house sitting in the suburbs. So it is maybe a sign that Kiwis are maturing and realising that not all your wealth has to go into a house. Maybe they'll just buy a nice 3-bedroom townhouse in a sort of reasonably not too far from town kind of area and then invest in the share market or other investments rather than putting all their wealth into a house. So maybe we are just very gradually starting to mature as a population in that regard, and maybe a housing market that's not going to look quite so attractive going forward is a driving force.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was engineered by Chris Wethy and produced by Gwen McClure. Thanks to Maria Slade, Sharon Zollner and Kelvin Davidson. I'm Alexia Russell. Ka kite.